Hi, I'm Michael Stittle.
And I'm Nick Nanos.
And welcome to Trendline. Nick, this episode, we'll be talking about how political leaders are responding to protests against systemic racism on both sides of the border. We're also going to look at the Republican and Democratic national conventions and how the Conservative convention stacks up. But first, I want to look at the toppling of a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in Montreal. Sir John A. Macdonald, obviously Canada's first prime minister, and also blamed for the residential school system. I want to just play a clip of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responding to that.
Those kinds of acts of vandalism are not advancing the path towards greater justice and equality in this country.
So Nick, what do you make of this response?
Well, you know, the Prime Minister has a very fine line that he has to tread. On the one hand, you know, everyone knows that he's very supportive and sympathetic of diversity, of inclusion, of equality, of the Black Lives Matter movement, of reconciliation with First Nations, Indigenous peoples. But at the other hand, he is the Prime Minister of Canada. You know, this act of, we should just call it this act of vandalism. It was intended to shock. It did shock many Canadians. And for those organizers and protesters that are passionate about what they believe, what they wanted to do was to capture the agenda, put a spotlight on inequality, and that there needs to be action. That said, I think the fact of the matter is that for the Liberal core voter, they're probably sympathetic to many of the demands and plights of marginalized Canadians. And at the same time, it's probably a little uncomfortable when it comes to what I'll say, defacing Canada's first Prime Minister, even though it's pretty clear that he was definitely imperfect on some public policy issues, specifically residential schools.
Justin Trudeau has also come under criticism for possibly performative acts. So as you said, Nick, he's come out for reconciliation, etc. But he was also at a protest, a Black Lives Matter protest, where he took the knee and came under criticism because it was a protest against government institutions, institutionalized racism. And as the Prime Minister, I suppose, who was he protesting against, if not himself? So if he's not taking concrete actions, is this opening him up to more criticism, especially if we head into a fall election?
Well, I think for some marginalized groups, and why don't we use Indigenous peoples as an example? You know, the Liberals, and you know, I say this without judgment, the Liberals have said many of the right things that Indigenous peoples and the leaders of Canada's First Nations wanted to hear in terms of more funding, you know, the big $10 billion announcement, the willingness and appetite to have reconciliation. But you know, you can imagine the frustration that's felt on the ground in First Nations communities right across the country when they don't feel that things are getting better and there's not actual movement. And getting away from talk to action and to delivering impact on the ground is probably what's important. And that's what the Liberals and Justin Trudeau specifically has to watch out for. It's not that he's saying the right or wrong things. It's just the perception that perhaps he is saying the right things, but that the impact is not being delivered on the ground. Mm-hmm. That's the gap that the Liberals have to close.
Now let's look at what our new Conservative Party leader, Erin O'Toole, had to say about the statue. He actually sent out a tweet, and I'm just going to read it. He said, "Canada wouldn't exist without Sir John A. Macdonald. Canada is a great country and one we should be proud of. We will not build a better future by defacing our past. It's time politicians grow a backbone and stand up for our country." So what do you make of that?
Well, you know, what's quite clear that the new Conservative Party leader, Erin O'Toole, wants to look strong and clear when it comes to this particular controversy, and doesn't want to get into what I'll say, get into the race, diversity, equality arguments. Mm-hmm. Probably feels more comfortable on law and order, right? Saying that he on principle opposes this types of violence and protest, that there's nothing wrong with people protesting, but that once you start defacing public property, and specifically something like a statue of our first Prime Minister, that you've crossed a line in terms of what an acceptable protest is in Canada. And expect him to tread a little carefully on this, because the fact of the matter is that for Erin O'Toole, if he wants to have a chance to become Prime Minister and win the next election, what he has to do is to continue to, and he started this, is to show that he's open, that he's welcoming, that he is embracing diversity. But what he also has to convey is that he understands how some of these marginalized Canadians feel, and also to put forth his own plan on how he would deal with a lot of these big issues that Canadians want to hear about.
Now, Erin O'Toole ran on a social conservative platform, let's say, and he was up against Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis, two other social conservatives, and he won. He got thousands of votes from social conservatives to push him over the edge and beat Peter MacKay. And as you said, Nick, he's really pushing a law and order agenda. He was asked recently about systemic racism and police forces on CTV's Your Morning, and this is what he had to say.
I think there's racism in Canada. But as I said, when I've heard law enforcement officers suggest that when that term is used without any specific detail, like what is the issue? Is there training problems? Is there an institutional problem? We have to make sure that we really get to the bottom of what we want to improve so that we can address communities' concerns or lack of trust with the police, for example, without suggesting that all members of a force are somehow racist.
So there you go, Nick. What do you think about that one?
Well, first of all, it's been traditional for many leaders of the Conservative Party and on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum to defend law enforcement officers, kind of side with the police, because they know that has a significant amount of appeal to many conservative-minded Canadians. What's interesting in O'Toole's response is that he wanted to focus on specifics to get past what I'll say the lip service that there's a problem and that something needs to be done, into what specifically needs to be done in order to solve this problem. And I think when it comes to issues such as the controversies related to a number of Canadians who are asking for the defunding of police and for policing to change, I would expect Erin O'Toole to say, let's be a little more specific. What needs to be changed? What needs to be changed? How would you like it to change? How is that going to impact not just how our communities work, but how law and order works? Because it's one thing to say that the police should be defunded, but the fact of the matter is that for many communities they need police in order to keep the peace and to keep our communities safe. So reconciling those two things are probably what he's trying to do.
Now, Nick, he's only been leader for what, a week, 2 weeks now, and there's some criticism that he's sort of a very similar leader to Andrew Scheer, and who was also a social conservative and who comes with the same baggage, and that if we do head into a fall election, we might just see a repeat of the last one. That there may not be as much of an appeal, to middle of the road voters to get into the Conservative Party. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think there's any change?
Well, I think it's unfair to say that any leader is the same as his or her predecessor. So I think that's a bit of an unfair criticism. I think the fact of the matter is that the jury, for average Canadians, the jury is still out on Erin O'Toole. It's obvious that he has a significant and strong following among Conservative Party members, which is what catapulted him into the leadership. But one of the things that I find quite interesting is that we track over time and every week, the proportion of Canadians that would consider or not consider voting for the Conservatives. And that's actually a bit of a leading indicator from a research perspective. People don't wake up one day saying that they're going to vote Liberal and the next day wake up and say they're going to vote Conservative. Usually there's a bit of a transition. And when you look at that trend line, that Nanos weekly trend line on consider voting Conservative, you can see there hasn't been any significant movement. It's basically a little north of about 4 out of every 10 Canadians that would consider voting Conservative. That's not enough to win an election. He's got to be between 45 and 50% at least in order to win the election and to challenge. So watch that number. If that number starts to move as people become more familiar and learn more about Erin O'Toole in the coming weeks and in the fall, the Liberals should watch out, because what it shows is that the Conservatives are increasingly being on the agenda, on the political menu, so to speak, as an alternative to the Liberals. If that number doesn't go up, structurally, it's just going to be hard for Erin O'Toole to win a majority government. He could potentially snatch a minority government if he had a really highly targeted campaign. But watch that number. We haven't seen it move. So we'll watch, it'll be like the dance of the seven veils, Michael, right? Learn more and more about Erin O'Toole. And I'd like to say public policy veils, not
Yeah, let's be clear on that.
public policy and political veils, where people learn more. And as they learn more and see more of Erin O'Toole, whether they're open to voting Conservative come the next federal election.
Wow. Now let's go south of the border, where we've had two extraordinary party conventions, all virtual. Well, in the Republican case, mostly virtual, I suppose. And it was against the backdrop of ongoing protests against systemic racism, against police brutality, anti-Black racism, where we've seen a number of fatal shootings recently. I want to start with the Republican convention. Just like O'Toole, I suppose they were really pushing a law and order message, and President Donald Trump really, pushing this message that a vote for the Democrats could be an end of peace in cities and the suburbs. I just want to play a clip of what Trump had to say.
At no time before have voters faced a clearer choice between two parties, two visions, two philosophies, or two agendas. This election will decide whether we save the American dream or whether we allow a socialist agenda to demolish our cherished destiny.
And before we talk about that, I just want to also play a clip from Rudy Giuliani, former New York mayor, and his personal lawyer, who also spoke at the convention.
Now today, my city is in shock. Murders, shootings, and violent crime are increasing at percentages unheard of in the past. We're seeing the return of rioting and looting. During riots, this Democrat mayor, like others, has often prevented the police from making arrests. And even when arrests are made, liberal, progressive DAs release the rioters so as not to disrupt the rioting.
Well, there you go, Nick. What do you think about this messaging?
Well, two different pages out of what's now the Trump political playbook. If you remember in the midterm elections, it was that elusive caravan of people that were threatening to come up from Mexico to the U.S. border, and Trump trying to stoke and fire up Americans during the midterm elections in order to get them to vote against the Democrats, and for him trying to look strong, creating basically that enemy kind of scenario. But that didn't work. And him doing the same thing now, basically stoking fear, playing the fear card. But the one thing that Trump does understand is that, in my 30 years of polling, one way that I can tell who's going to win the election is just to ask who this election is about. And, over the last while, the focus of the American populace has been on Donald Trump and his management of the coronavirus, and his numbers have suffered. What Donald Trump and the Republicans are trying to do is to now put a spotlight on Biden and the Democratic Party, to demonize them as socialists. And, I think in some cases they even referred to someone like Bernie Sanders, who is a progressive, as even, beyond being a socialist, to being a communist and leftist. But to use that type of language in order to fire up and to put a focus on the Democrats. So expect Donald Trump and the Republicans to say more sensational things to try to shift the focus from himself onto the Democrats. And if we get to November and the focus is on Biden, it'll be more of a difficult campaign for him. But if it stays on Trump, then Trump's going to be in trouble.
I noticed, speaking about the socialism attack by Trump, that at the convention they kept referring to the Chinese Communist government as somehow being responsible for sending the virus to the States. There's a lot of messaging like that, and we've also seen Trump delve into outright conspiracy theories on Twitter. Some of these QAnon things they keep coming out. Is this sort of like a desperate attempt here, or is he genuinely finding support through these means?
Well, he's not. I don't think he's growing support through these means, but there's a certain proportion of the American populace that when they think of any kind of communist or former communist country, they get a little nervous. It's kind of like it's the worst of the 1950s and McCarthyism, where groups are demonized, targeted, and for political gain. So I don't think this is a growth strategy for Trump. I think this is definitely a strategy to motivate his core to vote. And this is where, you know, this crazy mail voting stuff that's being discussed is quite critical. You know, what's clear in some of the research that's been done is that the Republicans and Trump supporters are much more likely to vote in person, while Democrats are much more likely to vote by mail. We may have a U.S. presidential election that is not decided on election night. We could have a U.S. presidential election where, through the in-person votes, Trump is leading, perhaps even declares victory based on the people that vote in person, and then for him to continue to cast aspersions and question mail-in ballots. So he's laying track down right now. He's laying track by undermining the validity, or from his perspective, undermining the credibility and reliability of mail voting, so that come election night, if he wins the in-person vote, or wins enough of the in-person votes, we might be in an odd situation where he declares victory. What do you do if the sitting president declares victory, even though there are a lot of ballots that aren't counted? And it's pretty clear that's that's probably one of the strategies that will be at his disposal, depending on what the election results are come November.
He's certainly doing things we've never seen a presidential candidate do before, outside of the normal bounds, yeah. I suppose. And I said it was a mostly virtual convention because, of course, he spoke at the White House, which is a pretty rare move. You know, in Canada, during a campaign, you're no longer the prime minister, you're the party leader. And here we have, he's full out speaking in front of the White House, live in front of a crowd. I didn't see that many masks, face coverings for COVID-19 in the audience. His cabinet was there as well. Is that a good strategy for him, sort of putting the weight of the presidency behind him?
Well, it's a good strategy for any incumbent president to use the office of the presidency. You know, there are kind of famous and infamous stories about the impact of Air Force One landing in your district and having the president either show up or not show up. The ironic twist here is that in many cases, the president is not welcome in some places. Just because of the controversy that follows him. But you know what we are seeing is an administration, and I shouldn't say an administration, a campaign, the Trump campaign, that is basically willing to use every tool at its disposal in order to try to win the election.
Let's flip over to the Democratic National Convention, which was completely virtual. It looked like most of the messaging was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris presenting themselves with just common decency, which we saw again and again. And I just want to play a clip of Joe Biden.
The current president has cloaked American darkness for much too long. Too much anger, too much fear, too much division. Here and now, I give you my word. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw on the best of us, not the worst. I will be an ally of the light, not the darkness.
Very Star Wars almost.
Yeah. So. But you know what? What he's trying to do is to be positive and to try to overcome the fear card that Donald Trump is playing, and to look like an alternative to Trump that will heal America and try to bring America together again. And you know, there was a very interesting survey that was done by Pew, the Pew Institute for Democracy and the People. And, you know, this particular survey kind of captures where America is at, where the parties are at too. You know, it asked a very simple question. You know, it had two different kind of statements. One statement was that something to the effect of the US is not perfect, but by focusing on our flaws, it weakens us. And the other statement was focusing on our flaws makes us a stronger country, right? So these are the two hypotheses that are being advanced for Donald Trump, for example, to say, you know what, we don't need to live in the past that makes us weak. And the Democrats saying, you know what, we do have flaws as a nation. We need to address those flaws and it makes us stronger. You know, the interesting thing is that when we look at all Americans, about 71% agree that focusing on the flaws makes us stronger, while only 28%. But when you look at those partisan numbers, that 71% pops up to 87% among Democrats. But when you look at Trump supporters and leaning Trump supporters, they're evenly divided. About half of people who are voting for Trump or say they're going to vote for Trump or are leaning toward Trump, half of them basically think that this focus on Black Lives Matter and all these flaws in America's history make America weak. So that probably explains why Trump is doing what he's doing, because it focuses on at least half of his core vote and motivates them, because they have a very dim view on the whole dialogue that's happening right now in the United States related to systemic problems that are there and how they are or are not being addressed.
We haven't really talked about the economy much, in these conventions. The economy is not doing very well in the States, partly because of the pandemic shutdowns. When does the economy become more of a major issue for the Biden campaign to attack Trump on?
I think the economy is probably going to be more of an issue in the close of the campaign in October. I think strategically, both the Republicans and the Democrats want to keep their powder dry on the economy, because they don't know. No one knows the state of the U.S. economy and what it will be come October, November when people vote. Because, for the Democrats, if they came out swinging on the economy and saying Donald Trump wasn't doing a very good job, they could deliver those punches today. But if in October the economy was looking good, they would basically be undercut by the data that would be, economic data that would be produced, and basically deliver an advantage to Donald Trump. So I think for both the Republican and the Democrat campaign, the economy will not necessarily be an issue until we have more clarity on how strong the U.S. economy will be in October, November. But watch it to be a critical factor for Americans, because many Americans vote based on pocketbook issues. And we also know from a polling perspective that when Americans feel good about the economy, that's usually good for incumbent presidents. It takes something pretty significant to unseat an incumbent president. Not saying it can't happen here, but it's just another thing that might help Donald Trump hold on to power.
Now, flipping back to Canada, we had our own convention here. It was the Conservative Party of Canada, another virtual convention. It had a major hiccup when the machines used to slice open the mail-in ballots actually cut into some of the ballots. There was a 7-hour delay. Yeah, so I mean that, we're in the middle of the summer as well. How much attention do you think the Conservative Convention got, and how much work does Erin O'Toole have in front of him to just get his name out there?
Well, he's going to have it's a steep climb for any leader of the opposition to build their profile, and usually people focus on the leader of the opposition when that person is in the House of Commons and they can grill the Prime Minister of the day. When that person is on the election hustings, where people can see the leader every day and how he or she might perform. So it's very difficult, in a way. By proroguing Parliament, Justin Trudeau basically removed any platform that Erin O'Toole might have in order to jumpstart his introduction to Canadians. So for the Conservatives, the key thing for them is that they have a leader, and now that they can transition to kind of rolling out their vision. And what's going to be critical is for Erin O'Toole to articulate how he is different from Justin Trudeau, how a Conservative government would be different in how it manages the COVID pandemic, and how it uses stimulus as a lever, its strategy for creating jobs, and what Canada would look like, how different it would look like under an Erin O'Toole premiership compared to being led by Justin Trudeau and the Liberals.
Now, this is probably a good moment to plug our next episode, which will show up in about, let's say 2 weeks. We're going to do a special opposition episode just ahead of, the throne speech is coming up. And we just want to look into what the opposition parties will have to say about that, the challenges ahead. So please watch for that one. Now, I cannot let this episode end, Nick, before talking about polling in the US, which seems to have its own challenges. I think a lot of people were surprised when Donald Trump won last time, because Hillary Clinton was ahead in the popular vote polling. Of course, they have their own system there. They've got the Electoral College, etc. Do you have any advice for our listeners and viewers, and what polling to watch for? What are the weaknesses and strengths in the U.S.?
So, one of the weaknesses is something that we talked about earlier in terms of this mail-in vote. So, when the votes were counted, especially at the beginning of election night, that basically focused on individuals who had voted that day, it looked a little different than the actual voting results.
Mm-hmm.
The pollsters were right after all the mail-in ballots were counted, and we may find out that we have that similar type of phenomenon where the polling does not jive with what is counted on election night, because there could be tens of millions of ballots that are counted by mail over a 10-day period after the election. So we may get into that. So I think on election night, everyone should keep their powder dry when it comes to comparing the pollsters to the election results, because we might not have a clear view on what those election results are. The other thing is we focus on the popular support. Hillary Clinton won the popular support, but lost the Electoral College. So you have that kind of twist in all of this. And what's interesting, if you start to look at the details at what some pollsters are doing, is they're trying to factor what they're calling a shy Trump vote to see whether he potentially could be underrepresented in some of the polls. And it's too early to tell whether that's an appropriate approach or whether it'll work. But I'll tell you one thing. What's interesting is, when you look, there was a survey that was just released this week. It was, I believe, it was a USA Today, Suffolk University survey. It showed Biden at around 50%, Trump at 43%, 7-point margin. Just a few weeks ago, ahead of both of those conventions, Biden was enjoying anywhere from a 10 to 12-point margin.
Wow.
So, things are starting to narrow a little bit. But, what I would hazard to say is that the reality is a strong lead for any party is probably 4 or 5 percentage points. That, this 10, 11, 12 percentage point advantage for the Democrats was probably really a bit of a false hope that it was puffed up a bit just because of when the survey was done. So, there'll be a narrative. Here's one prediction. There'll be a narrative that the race is tightening up between Trump and Biden, although the reality is it's really just a technical correction to the true advantage that Biden has. And even if he has only a 5 or 6 point advantage, that's potentially a massive win for the Democrats come the presidential election. So for all of our viewers and listeners, you may clutch your chest when you see the race narrowing, but the fact of the matter is it's probably more of a technical correction as to the true strength of Donald Trump and Biden, where Biden has a strong advantage, but it's just not massively 10 points.
Wow, interesting. Nick, I think we'll end it there. What's your big takeaway for this episode?
My big takeaway on this episode is watch out for issues related to marginalized groups, Indigenous people, Black Lives Matter, that for those Canadians that are into this particular issue, they're highly motivated. They want politicians to act, and they'll see the election as a platform to disrupt things in order to get the attention of Canadians and also to get our political leaders to move on these issues. So it's going to be a wild card from a public policy perspective and from a political perspective as Canadians who want to advance this whole idea of marginalization and income inequality see the upcoming election as an opportunity to put that on the political agenda.
Great. Nick, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nick, N-I-K, Nanos, or on the web, go to www.nanos.co to get all those stats.
And I'm also on Twitter at Michael Stittle, and you can also find more about the stories that we've discussed in this episode on CTVNews.ca. Thanks for listening and watching.